Imagine you've got a job to do at home. You want to hang a picture on the wall. So actually what you need is a hole in the wall to put a screw in, or perhaps a nail that you can bang in the wall, something fairly simple that does the job of hanging your picture. What you probably don't want is a laser-guided 47-speed 27,000 drill bit electric drill kit. That's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It's over the top. And it's a typical example of the problem we often have of overshooting what people need. Think about word processing. I guess most of you at some stage use a word processor, whether it's Microsoft or someone else's. There's a menu line along the top of all the things you could do with that word processor. Now be honest, of all the things your word processor could do, how much do you actually use? Now, I write for a living, and I have to be honest, if I use 20%, I'm probably being very optimistic. So what we're really saying with something like that is, for quite an expensive product, we're only using about 20% of all the things it could do. So this is a real challenge. Lots of products have this tendency for overshooting what we need. And they do at least raise the question, what if it was just good enough, just what we needed for the job? And this is an approach which is becoming quite challenging in thinking about innovation. It's an approach which has had very many different labels in the past. The current one is frugal innovation. Frugal as in not wasting anything. Now actually it's a fairly well-known idea, particularly in the field of process innovation. The way we do things, physical products don't appear, factories in various different ways make them, but any business, any organisation, public or private, has all sorts of activities to enable it to get its job done, processes. And what we've learned, and we've really been learning hard since the 1980s, is we could improve those processes, particularly by cutting out the waste, by simplifying, by making them more direct, making them do just the job they're supposed to do. And all sorts of labels have come up for the methodologies to do that. One of the most powerful, of course, has been lean thinking, which by its nature was all about taking out the waste from processes. But there was also a big movement in the 1990s around business process re-engineering, business process improvement. Again, trying to simplify processes, take out the unnecessary stages and steps. And much of the quality revolution right back into the 70s was again around looking at processes and taking out the waste. So we've got a long tradition and plenty of strong examples of how process innovation can be made more frugal. It becomes a little more tricky when we think about products, because products by their nature are things which certainly can be frugal, just good enough for the job, but in a competitive world that may not be enough. If we think about the challenge of differentiation, way back in the early days of the motor car, Henry Ford started to win. He wasn't the first car maker. In fact, he was about number 65 in terms of car companies. The difference with Ford was he got the product right. The product was the car for the market that did the job everyone wanted. A car for every man at the price every man can afford. That was his idea. And for a long time the Model T was dominant. But Ford's market share slipped as General Motors began to work on the idea of product differentiation, of offering different things for different people and meeting those needs. And that sets up a tension which is there today, because it isn't just a case of wanting products. In a competitive world, we also want different features around them. So this is part of our challenge, and it's what leads to the overshoot. We add different features, even if at times people don't always want them. But there is this tension in products which is perhaps less there in processes. So we have this risk of overshoot, and there's a challenge around that in product innovation particularly. Why is frugal innovation becoming important now? Why has it come back into focus again? And I think there are a couple of reasons. One of them, of course, is the huge growth in the economy is coming in the emerging markets. And a very big chunk of those emerging markets are in rural Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, in places which are sometimes called base of the pyramid markets, because although they're high in volume, the actual purchasing power of any individual is quite low. Base of the pyramid markets often have very, very low incomes per head. Less than $2 a day is a typical number. So the business model there is essentially one of high volume, low margin, and there's a strong emphasis on value. Given you only have a little money, you're going to be very careful how you spend it. And this has driven some very interesting changes in the behavior of many organizations in terms of addressing those markets, simplifying the products and making them just good enough for what's a very big level of demand. So for example, companies like Procter & Gamble and Unilever able to sell shampoo in single sachet sizes as opposed to the large volume, a relatively large volume of a 250 milliliter bottle. Something like that is an example of trying to address the base of the pyramid. Perhaps one of the most interesting recent developments has been the thinking about motor cars in India. In India, for a long, long time, the main means of transport for middle class was the ubiquitous motorbike. And if ever you visit India, it's amazing the number of people who seem able to balance on the back of a motorbike. But that same group of people, as living standards now rise, are aspiring to a car. And so there's a real market opportunity, but it's not necessarily a market opportunity that's characterized by a lot of income. And so for many years, organizations, companies have been looking to try and develop a low-cost car, good enough for that market segment. Perhaps the pioneers of this were Tata, who developed the Nano. And the idea of the Nano was a car that would sell for around 2,000 euros. So very low cost, very straightforward and simple, but safe and reliable. And of course that's a selling price, so it's got to be manufactured and an entire supply chain have to support that for a much lower price. Well, the Nano, for various reasons, hasn't been a runaway success, but the thinking behind it certainly has. And one of the companies which has worked very hard on this frugal approach is Renault. And Renault have recently launched the Kwid, which is essentially their version of a Nano, a low-cost car targeted for that market. A car that sells for a much lower price than anything we find in Europe, but indeed building on the huge success of the Logan, which was also a Renault brand coming out originally from Romania. So these are examples where in the emerging markets, this challenge of producing something which is good enough opens up opportunities and certainly raises some question marks about what the existing producers might want to offer. But there's a second reason why frugal innovation could be important, which is that even in the developed world there are increasing concerns about value. Think, for example, about the car, and imagine if the proposition was that instead of spending several more thousand euros, you were able to buy something that was reliable, perhaps electrically powered, and essentially geared around short journeys in the city. But if you were able to buy that for a fraction of the price that you might normally pay, it might be of interest. Certainly there's a lot of interest in places like India around producing low-cost computers and other devices, and there's some evidence that these are beginning to spread back into developed world markets. The place we've seen this, of course, is particularly in flying. The whole low-cost airline model was essentially based on a simplification. On low-cost airlines, particularly for short-haul flights, the challenge was how do we move quickly and cheaply from A to B? And none of the frills, none of the, if you like, overshoot factors are particularly important there. And the huge growth, the revolution, the disruption in those markets has been driven essentially by a frugal approach. So there's a big challenge here, and it's a challenge, of course, which is not binary. It's not simply either frugal or a fully featured product. The challenge is how can we manage both? How can we have opportunities and how can we exploit opportunities both at the frugal end, which is a challenge around value, but also in a different kind of value challenge, how do we offer features to those that would value them? Well, how would we enable frugal innovation is the big question. And the good news is there's plenty of knowledge already there. This is not necessarily a field in which there's not been effort. For a long time, we've thought hard about frugal approaches in product and process innovation. And in a sense, what we're looking to do now in the 21st century is what I'd call extended value engineering. Building on well-proven tools and techniques, but applying them, at least challenging ourselves to think about applying them in our own markets, both our developed world markets and increasingly in the emerging world markets. Step one, as always, has to start with the customer. What do customers value? Can we identify the voice of the customer? Now, we know a lot about that, and in particular, listening to customers and understanding what they want, there are some powerful tools. The Kano method, essentially breaks what customers want into things that they absolutely want. If they don't get them, they'll be dissatisfied. So that's a kind of negative thing, but also things that would delight. And that is a very powerful tool for identifying for different market segments what people might actually want and value. More recently, we've had in the Blue Ocean strategy approach the notion of value curves, again building on well-known principles, but understanding what is it that people really want, what might be the differentiator, but what would just be adding overshoot and not necessarily adding any value. But step one clearly doesn't change. Start with the customer and understand that external value concept. But then explore the processes that create that value inside the organization. How might we deliver this? And the good news here is we've got tools. Value engineering, systematically taking cost out, reducing functions, reducing complexity. Lots of tools for doing this. Target costing, very powerful and rigorous methodology. And perhaps one of the most useful tools, variations on quality function deployment. Ways of bringing together all the different people who work together, whose input helps create the product or service, and putting their ideas together. Shared creativity around driving value forward and driving costs down towards a frugal end. And perhaps the other point is working with users, not just at the front end identifying their needs, but trying out with them. The notion of prototyping, of co-creating. We can perhaps take a leaf from the entrepreneur's book here. Classic thinking now about entrepreneurship is try it out. The minimum viable product. It may not be right. The market may send you a signal that says, we don't like this. But in interacting with them, you can begin to pivot. You can move towards something that is what they want. So this idea of co-creating and working with users around coming up with a value proposition which would work for them and which gives an opportunity to exploit the frugal approach certainly lends itself to this entrepreneurial perspective. So the idea of frugal innovation, absolutely not new. It's been around a long time. We've used it very well and very effectively in processes. Maybe it's worth taking another look at frugal approaches, particularly in the area of products and services.